She said the road was already approved. Then the bulldozers showed up on my land. I called the sheriff. My fences were gone by morning. Weeks passed. Then I found the forged signature. I smiled and signed the sale papers. 3 days later, their only road disappeared forever. My name is Thomas Hale, and the land I'm about to tell you about has been in my family since 1961. 2,300 acres of ranch and timber outside a small Texas county, bordering a gated community called Cedar Ridge Estates. I live simply, raise cattle, and mostly keep to myself. I never wanted trouble with my neighbors. Cedar Ridge went up 15 years ago on land my father sold to a developer, and I kept my side of the fence line clean and honest ever since. I had no idea one woman on their board would try to take the rest. Marlene Vance became HOA president 2 years before any of this started. She'd moved to Cedar Ridge from Dallas with a binder full of bylaws and a voice that carried across 3 cul-de-sacs. Neighbors joked she ran the community like a small nation, complete with fines for the wrong shade of mailbox. The trouble began quietly, the way these things always do. Cedar Ridge's original entrance road looped through a floodplain that washed out every spring, stranding residents for days at a time. Marlene decided the community needed a second entrance. She decided it needed to cross my land. At first it was just a letter, polite enough, asking if the HOA could explore an access agreement through the northeast corner of my property. I wrote back and declined. That corner held my grandfather's grave marker and the only clean creek crossing on the whole ranch. A month later, a survey crew showed up anyway. I found their stakes driven into the ground near the creek, orange flags snapping in the wind like they already owned the place. When I called the surveying company, they said Cedar Ridge HOA had hired them under an existing easement. No such easement existed. My father's original deed was clean. No encumbrances. No rights-of-way granted to any development. I drove to the county recorder's office myself and pulled every document on file. Nothing. Inventing paperwork that didn't exist yet. I confronted Marlene at a community meeting I wasn't even supposed to attend. She smiled the whole time, told me the access matter was under legal review, and that I'd receive formal correspondence soon. She spoke like a woman already certain of the outcome, like my objection was a formality. My neighbor Ruth, who'd lived at Cedar Ridge since it broke ground, pulled me aside after. She warned me Marlene had steamrolled 2 other board members out of their positions for disagreeing with her, and that the HOA's legal fund had grown suspiciously large under her watch. I should have taken that warning more seriously. Instead, I went home, checked my fences, and told myself a suburban HOA couldn't possibly touch 2,300 acres of private ranchland. I had a deed. I had every legal right on my side. What I didn't have yet was any idea how far someone convinced of their own righteousness would go. Marlene wasn't just protecting her community's convenience. She was building a legacy project, something she could point to as her crowning achievement as president. My land was simply in the way. The formal correspondence arrived 2 weeks later. A thick packet from a law firm in Houston claiming Cedar Ridge held a prescriptive easement across my northeast corner, based on decades of alleged community use. I'd never seen a single Cedar Ridge resident cross that creek in my life. My lawyer, a longtime family friend named Ellis Whitcomb, called it garbage the moment he read it. Prescriptive easements require open, continuous, hostile use for years, documented and provable.
Marlene's claim rested on 2 blurry photos and a
Still, garbage claims cost money to fight. Ellis warned me litigation could drag for a year, maybe longer, and Cedar Ridge's legal fund seemed bottomless. I wondered where an HOA of 400 homes found the money to fight a rancher over a dirt creek crossing nobody used. I started keeping a folder. Every letter, every survey stake photo, every date and time. Ranching teaches you patience and record keeping, whether you're tracking cattle weights or fence repairs. I didn't know yet that folder would become the most important thing I owned. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, I drove out to check the north pasture and found something that changed everything. A gravel access road, freshly graded, cutting straight through my land toward the creek. Cedar Ridge hadn't waited for any court. They'd simply built it. I stood at the edge of that gravel road with my hands shaking. Not from cold but from a fury I hadn't felt since my father passed. 2 bulldozers sat parked near the tree line, engines still ticking as they cooled. Someone had done this overnight. Deliberately, while I slept. I called the sheriff's department immediately. The dispatcher took my report calmly, promised a deputy would come out. 3 hours later, nobody had shown. I called again. Deputy assigned, got pulled to another call, and would reschedule for the following week. That delay felt wrong from the start, though I couldn't prove anything yet. I photographed every foot of that road, the torn-up fence posts, the flattened section of my grandfather's old cattle guard. I sent copies to Ellis before I even left the pasture, my hands still trembling with anger. Marlene's response, when I finally reached her by phone, floored me. She said the road was already approved by the county, that Cedar Ridge had every right to proceed once their engineer confirmed the easement. She spoke with the calm certainty of someone reading from a script she'd rehearsed for weeks. I demanded to see this county approval. She said her attorney would forward documentation in due course. That phrase, in due course, would become the answer to nearly every question I asked over the following months. A wall of bureaucratic delay hiding whatever was actually happening behind it. Ellis filed an emergency injunction that same week, demanding Cedar Ridge halt all construction until ownership was legally settled. The judge granted a temporary restraining order within days. I thought that would end it, that the law would simply step in and stop the bulldozing cold. Instead, Marlene held a community meeting that night, standing in front of a projector slide showing my ranch highlighted in red, calling me an obstructionist landowner blocking emergency access for 400 families. She never mentioned the road already existed for 15 years without needing my land at all. Neighbors I'd known casually for years started avoiding eye contact at the feed store. Someone spray-painted "selfish" across my mailbox post. I hadn't done anything except refuse to hand over family land based on a fabricated legal claim. Yet somehow I'd become the villain of Cedar Ridge's story. My daughter Emily, away at college, called worried after seeing photos online. Apparently Marlene had started a neighborhood Facebook group titled Safe Roads for Cedar Ridge, posting daily updates painting me as a reckless rancher endangering children's lives by blocking a critical emergency route from a flood zone. I hadn't blocked anything. While inconvenient, remained perfectly functional except during the worst spring floods, which happened maybe twice a decade. Marlene's campaign conveniently ignored that Cedar Ridge had survived 15 years without my creek crossing and could survive 15 more. Ellis discovered something troubling while researching the county approval Marlene claimed to have. No such permit existed in county records. The road construction had proceeded entirely without authorization, county or otherwise. Whatever Marlene told her board and her neighbors, she'd been lying from the very beginning. I brought this to the sheriff's department directly, document in hand, proof the road was built with 0 county permits on private property despite a restraining order. This time a deputy did come out, wrote a report, and told me it would go to the county attorney for review. Weeks passed with no word. I later learned, through a records request Ellis filed, that the county commissioner overseeing road permits happened to be Marlene's husband's college roommate. I couldn't prove collusion yet, but the coincidence sat in my stomach like a stone I couldn't swallow down. Cedar Ridge's HOA newsletter that month ran a full page about community resilience against outside obstruction, featuring a photo of Marlene standing triumphantly at the edge of the unfinished road. She turned an illegal construction project into a rallying cry, and her neighbors were cheering her on. I started losing sleep, replaying every conversation, wondering what I'd missed. My wife, Carol, gone 3 years now to cancer, would have known exactly how to handle a woman like Marlene. I just knew how to run cattle and keep my word. Those skills weren't going to be enough here. Ruth called me late one night, voice hushed like she was hiding in a closet. She said Marlene had been quietly assessing homeowners a special infrastructure fee for over a year, money nobody could account for on the HOA's public books. Something bigger than a road was clearly happening. I thanked Ruth and told her to be careful. If Marlene would forge a county permit and bulldoze private property in broad daylight, I had no doubt she'd retaliate against anyone she suspected of feeding me information. The folder in my truck kept growing thicker by the week. The restraining order held, technically, but Marlene found ways around it that made a mockery of the court's authority. Survey crews returned under the guise of environmental assessment, walking the creek line daily, taking soil samples I never authorized, treating my land like it already belonged to Cedar Ridge. I put up new fencing along the entire northeast boundary, thick cedar posts and hog wire, a physical statement that this land was mine and mine alone. Within a week, someone cut 3 sections clean through under cover of darkness. My cattle wandered loose into the Cedar Ridge greenbelt overnight. Animal control fined me $200 for livestock at large, a fine I paid while pointing out the deliberately cut fence in the accompanying photos. The officer shrugged and said that wasn't her department's problem. Everywhere I turned, the system seemed built to shrug at exactly the wrong moments. Marlene sent a formal HOA notice demanding I properly contain my animals or face further fines, as though the sabotage never happened. I forwarded the notice to Ellis with a single line. Does she really think nobody sees what she's doing? Ellis's reply was simply that she probably did. That was the moment I truly understood what I was dealing with. Marlene wasn't just stubborn or entitled. She was strategic, patient, willing to manufacture chaos and then demand I clean it up on her terms. Every move she made was designed to exhaust me into surrender. One small cut at a time, I installed trail cameras along the fence line that week. Hidden in the brush, batteries fresh. If someone wanted to keep destroying my property in the dark, I intended to have proof. Ellis said good cameras might finally give us something concrete to bring to a judge who actually listened. 2 nights later, the cameras caught it. A truck, headlights off, parking near my north gate at 2 a.m. 2 figures cutting wire with bolt cutters, moving with the casual confidence of people who'd done this before and never expected consequences. I couldn't make out faces, but I had a truck plate. The plate traced back to a landscaping company Cedar Ridge HOA contracted regularly for common area maintenance. The same company that had graded the illegal road in the first place. Ellis said it wasn't enough alone to prove Marlene ordered it, but it was another thread in a growing rope. I filed a police report with the footage attached. This time, finally, a detective took real interest. Someone new to the department who hadn't been quietly steered away from my case like the others. Detective Reyes asked sharp questions and wrote everything down without once looking bored or dismissive. Marlene, hearing about the investigation somehow before I even told anyone outside my own family, launched her most aggressive campaign yet. Flyers appeared around Cedar Ridge, accusing me of harassing hardworking contractors and endangering community safety by fencing off land she claimed had always been a shared access point. I'd lived on that ranch my entire life. Nobody had ever shared that creek crossing with anyone. But truth mattered less inside Cedar Ridge's gates than Marlene's version of events. Repeated often enough and loud enough that 400 families started believing it without ever once checking a county record themselves. My neighbor Hank, who ran Cattle 2 properties over, told me at the co-op that Marlene had cornered him about testifying that Cedar Ridge residents historically used my creek crossing for recreation. Hank refused, and never once seen a soul from that subdivision near my land. That refusal apparently didn't sit well. Within days, Hank received his own HOA-adjacent complaint, though he wasn't even a Cedar Ridge resident. Some anonymous tip to the county about unpermitted structures on his property. It felt less like coincidence and more like a warning to anyone who wouldn't cooperate. Ellis started documenting a pattern. Every person who publicly supported me, or simply declined to support Marlene, faced some form of retaliation within 2 weeks. Fines, complaints, sudden code enforcement visits. It read less like community governance and more like an organized campaign of intimidation against dissent. I began driving the property line every single morning before sunrise, coffee in hand, checking fences, checking cameras, checking for anything out of place. It became a ritual of vigilance I never asked for, guarding land my family had held peacefully for 60 years against people determined to take it. Detective Reyes called with an update. The landscaping company's foreman, questioned separately, admitted under pressure that Marlene personally directed the road construction and specifically told his crew to proceed regardless of any paperwork issues, since she assured them legal matters were already handled through the HOA's attorney. That admission mattered enormously. It proved Marlene knowingly ordered construction on private property without lawful authority, directly contradicting her public claims of county approval. Ellis said we finally had enough for a civil suit with real teeth, on top of whatever criminal exposure Marlene now faced for trespass and property destruction. Marlene, perhaps sensing the walls closing in, shifted tactics entirely. She stopped mentioning the road publicly and instead focused the HOA newsletter on a new narrative, painting herself as a victim of a wealthy landowner's lawsuit intimidation against a community simply trying to protect itself. The gall took my breath away. I wasn't wealthy, keeping the operation profitable most years. now bleeding money into legal fees to defend land my family bled sweat into for generations. But wealthy sounded better in her narrative than the truth. So wealthy is what 400 homeowners were told to believe. Carol's sister Diane, who still lived nearby, warned me people in town had started taking sides, some even avoiding my booth at the farmer's market. It stung more than I expected. I'd spent decades building quiet trust in this community, and one woman's campaign was unraveling it in months. Ellis reminded me that public opinion, however unfair, wasn't the same as legal standing. We had the deed, the survey records, the forged permit claims, the sabotage footage, and now a foreman's sworn statement. Whatever Marlene was winning in the court of neighborhood gossip, she was losing badly in the court of law. Still, the pressure took a toll. I found myself snapping at Emily on the phone over nothing, sleeping in restless stretches, checking my email obsessively for the next HOA letter or lawsuit filing. Grief for Carol resurfaced in strange moments, a reminder of how much harder this would have been to face alone. One evening, Ruth showed up at my door unannounced, carrying a thick manila folder of her own. She'd been quietly collecting HOA financial disclosures for over a year, suspicious of Marlene's spending long before any of this started. And she said it was time I saw exactly what she'd found. The documents showed Cedar Ridge's legal fund had grown by nearly $200,000 over 18 months, funded through a special infrastructure assessment, charged to every homeowner without a proper vote. Buried in fine print most residents never read closely. Marlene had built her war chest quietly, patiently, illegally. Ruth also found something stranger: recurring payments to a consulting firm registered at the same address as Marlene's husband's real estate office. Money moving in a circle, HOA funds flowing out to a business connected to Marlene's own family, disguised as legitimate community expenses on paper that looked clean at a glance. Ellis's eyes lit up reviewing it. Financial misconduct combined with the trespass and forged permit claims painted a much bigger picture than a stubborn HOA president overstepping her authority. This looked increasingly like a woman using her position for personal enrichment, with the illegal road serving some larger unstated purpose. I asked Ruth why she'd waited so long to bring this forward. She admitted fear. The same fear that kept most Cedar Ridge residents quiet. Marlene controlled architectural approvals, fine assessments, even parking enforcement. Crossing her meant inviting scrutiny into every corner of your own life. However innocent you actually were, that fear, I realized, was the real foundation of Marlene's power. Not legitimate authority, but manufactured dependency. For 100 families too afraid of petty retaliation to question a woman quietly bleeding their community dry. My land dispute had accidentally cracked open something far larger than a disagreement over a road. Detective Reyes's investigation expanded once Ellis shared Ruth's financial records with the county. What began as a property dispute was quietly becoming a fraud investigation, though nobody outside a small circle knew that yet. Marlene continued her public campaign, unaware the ground beneath her was already starting to shift. I started noticing Marlene's husband, Gerald, at community meetings more often, standing quietly near the back, watching everything unfold. I'd never had reason to think much about him before, but now I wondered exactly how much he knew about the consulting payments flowing into his own real estate office. Gerald approached me once at the hardware store, oddly cordial, saying he hoped all this business could be resolved amicably for everyone's sake. Something about his tone felt rehearsed, like a man trying to gauge how much I actually knew before deciding whether panic was warranted on his end. I told him nothing, kept my answers polite and vague, and drove home, turning the conversation over in my mind. Ellis later said that encounter alone suggested Gerald was more involved than a passive spouse, someone actively monitoring the fallout from whatever arrangement he and Marlene had built together. The illegal road itself sat unfinished, a scar of gravel cutting across my northeast pasture, halted by the court order but never removed. Every time I drove past it, I felt the same hot anger from that first morning, the violation of watching bulldozers carve through land my grandfather once walked. Ellis filed a motion demanding Cedar Ridge remove the road entirely and restore the land at their own expense. Marlene's attorney fought it fiercely, arguing removal would waste community resources better spent completing what they insisted was a vital safety project. The absurdity of that argument almost made me laugh. The judge wasn't amused either. During a hearing that October, she pressed Marlene's attorney directly on the missing county permit, watching him stumble through vague answers about administrative delays that clearly hadn't fooled her for a second. I left the courthouse that day feeling hope for the first time in months. Marlene, however, doubled down rather than retreat. That same week, Cedar Ridge's board, under her direction, voted to place a lien against my property for damages caused by construction delays, an audacious claim that I'd somehow cost the HOA money by refusing to let them illegally build on my own land. Ellis called it one of the boldest legal moves he'd seen in 20 years of practice, not because it had any chance of succeeding, but because of the sheer nerve required to file it at all. Marlene was betting everything on exhausting me financially before the truth caught up with her. I started to wonder what exactly Marlene was protecting so desperately. A community access road, however convenient, didn't justify forged permits, financial fraud, sabotage, and a lien built on fiction. Something else had to be driving this, some deeper stake in that creek crossing that none of us understood yet. Ruth, still digging through old HOA records, found the answer buried in a 15-year-old development proposal nobody had looked at in years. Cedar Ridge's original developer had planned a second phase, 40 additional homes, blocked for over a decade by lack of a viable second entrance road across my land. Marlene, turned out, held an undisclosed financial stake in that dormant development company through a shell entity registered under her maiden name. If the road went through, that stalled second phase could finally break ground, and Marlene stood to profit enormously from land she didn't even own herself. For a few weeks, an uneasy quiet settled over the whole situation. The lien sat frozen pending Ellis's challenge. The road remained unfinished, and Marlene's public campaign softened slightly, perhaps sensing the growing legal exposure. I almost let myself believe the worst of it might finally be behind me. I spent those quiet weeks doing ordinary ranch work, mending the cut fences properly, moving cattle to fresh pasture, sitting on my porch at dusk the way I used to with Carol. It felt strange to breathe normally again, even knowing the fight was far from over beneath the surface calm. Emily came home for a long weekend, and we didn't talk about the HOA once. Just fixed a broken gate together and grilled steaks like nothing had changed. Those small ordinary moments meant more to me than any court victory could. A reminder of exactly what I was actually protecting here. Detective Reyes called during that lull with an update rather than a resolution. The fraud investigation into Marlene's consulting payments had expanded to include the county commissioner's office, given the suspicious permit timeline. She warned me these things moved slowly, but the pieces were clearly falling into place behind closed doors. Ellis used the quiet period to prepare our civil case methodically, deposing HOA board members one by one. Two of them, clearly uncomfortable, admitted Marlene rarely brought major financial decisions to a full vote, instead pushing them through as urgent matters that bypassed normal community approval procedures entirely. One board member, a soft-spoken retired teacher named Alan, admitted he'd raised concerns about the special assessment months earlier and been quietly removed from the finance committee shortly after. Marlene had a pattern, seemed, of neutralizing dissent before it could ever gain real traction within her own board. I found myself almost pitying Marlene during that lull, wondering what drove someone to build an entire architecture of control and deception rather than simply live peacefully within her means. But pity faded fast whenever I remembered the cut fences, the stray cattle fines, the lien on my own home. Ruth mentioned Marlene had grown visibly stressed at recent board meetings, snapping at members over minor issues, calling emergency sessions late at night. Whatever calm she projected publicly seemed to be cracking privately, the pressure of maintaining so many layered lies finally beginning to show through the cracks. I used the quiet weeks to reconnect with old friends I'd distanced myself from during the worst of the fighting, people who'd stood by me even when town gossip turned ugly. Their loyalty reminded me that Marlene's manufactured narrative, however loud, never represented the whole truth of who I actually was. Gerald appeared at my gate one evening, alone this time, without Marlene's polished confidence backing him. He asked, almost desperately, whether I'd consider settling everything quietly, offering a sum of money that felt suspiciously precise for a man who claimed to have no real involvement in his wife's decisions. I declined without hesitation. No amount of money could undo cut fences, forged permits, or months of public humiliation, and accepting a payout now would only bury whatever fraud Ellis and Detective Reyes were still uncovering. Gerald left looking more rattled than when he'd arrived, which told me plenty. Ellis said Gerald's offer, though informal, could actually help our case. Evidence that Marlene's camp understood exactly how much legal exposure they faced and were desperate to make the whole situation disappear before it reached a courtroom or, worse for them, a criminal indictment neither could survive politically. I photographed the moment Gerald's car left my driveway, time-stamped, just in case. Old habits from the folder I'd started building months earlier. Every instinct told me the quiet wouldn't last much longer, and I intended to be ready with proof the moment Marlene's next move finally arrived. Sure enough, 2 weeks later, everything shattered wide open again. Detective Reyes called, voice tight with urgency, asking Ellis and me to come to the station immediately. Whatever calm I'd allowed myself to feel evaporated instantly. Marlene, seemed, hadn't been quiet at all. She'd simply been planning something worse. Detective Reyes laid it out plainly across her desk. Financial records now showed Marlene had forged not just the county permit, but an entire fabricated survey document, complete with a stolen digital signature from a retired county surveyor who confirmed he'd never authorized or even seen the paperwork bearing his name. That forgery elevated everything into felony territory. document fraud on top of the trespass and financial misconduct already building against her. Reyes said an arrest warrant was being prepared, though the timing depended on coordinating with the county attorney's office to ensure the case against Marlene was airtight from every angle. I should have felt triumphant hearing that. Instead, I felt a cold unease, remembering how effectively Marlene had dodged consequences for months already. Women like her didn't simply accept defeat quietly, and I suspected she already sensed the walls closing in, which meant her next move would likely be desperate. My suspicion proved correct within days. Marlene called an emergency HOA meeting, standing before 400 families and declaring, with tears that felt calculated rather than genuine, that I was orchestrating a personal vendetta against her using fabricated police accusations meant to destroy her reputation and steal community resources. It was breathtaking, the audacity of flipping every proven fact into an accusation against me instead. Ruth texted me a video from the meeting, Marlene's voice cracking dramatically as she described feeling targeted and harassed by a wealthy landowner determined to punish her for simply serving her community. Several residents, I later learned, walked out of that meeting unconvinced, having seen enough contradictory evidence circulating privately by then. But enough remained loyal, or simply afraid of losing HOA favor, that Marlene still commanded a passionate base ready to defend her against whatever was coming next. Ellis warned me Marlene's performance wasn't random desperation. It was strategy, laying groundwork for a jury pool, ensuring that if criminal charges came, plenty of neighbors would testify to her supposed victimhood rather than the mountain of fraud evidence Detective Reyes had spent months carefully assembling against her. I started receiving anonymous messages after that meeting, vague threats disguised as concern, warning me to drop this before things get worse for everyone involved. I forwarded every single one to Ellis and Reyes, refusing to let intimidation change course now that the truth was finally within reach. Emily, hearing about the threats, insisted on coming home immediately, worried for my safety. I told her to stay at school, that I had cameras, a detective's direct line, and Ellis handling every legal angle. Privately, though, I started sleeping with a shotgun within reach for the first time in years. Ruth, meanwhile, faced her own retaliation for cooperating with the investigation. Her HOA dues suddenly tripled due to an administrative recalculation, and her long-approved backyard shed received a surprise violation notice demanding immediate removal. Marlene's grip on Cedar Ridge's machinery of petty punishment remained fully intact. Warrant or no warrant, Alan, the former finance committee member, faced similar pressure. A sudden lawsuit threat from the HOA over a fence height violation that had existed unquestioned for 8 years. It felt less like coincidence and more like Marlene systematically punishing everyone who'd cooperated with the investigation closing in around her. I brought this pattern to Reyes directly, and she agreed it strengthened the case considerably, showing a clear ongoing pattern of retaliation against witnesses even after the fraud investigation had begun. Prosecutors, she said, took witness intimidation extremely seriously, especially when documented as thoroughly as we now had it. Meanwhile, the civil case over my land moved forward in parallel. The judge, clearly losing patience with Cedar Ridge's stalling tactics, set a firm date for a full hearing on both the injunction and the fraudulent lien, giving Marlene's attorneys 30 days to produce evidence that plainly didn't exist. I spent those 30 days preparing meticulously with Ellis, organizing 18 months of documentation into a case so thorough it felt almost overwhelming even to me, the man who'd lived every exhausting day of it firsthand. Photographs, financial records, forged documents, sworn statements, all building toward one inevitable conclusion. Marlene's attorneys, sensing the case slipping away, requested a continuance, claiming they needed more time to gather additional evidence, supporting the prescriptive easement claim. The judge denied it flatly, noting the case had already dragged 8 months past reasonable timelines for what should have been simple property law. I watched Marlene in the courthouse hallway during a brief recess, no longer projecting her usual polished confidence. She looked tired, older somehow, gripping her attorney's arm while whispering urgently. Whatever calculations she'd made months earlier clearly weren't accounting for how thoroughly the truth had finally caught up with her. Gerald wasn't present at that hearing, which struck me as strange given how invested he'd seemed weeks earlier. Ruth later mentioned rumors circulating through Cedar Ridge that Gerald had moved out of their house entirely, distancing himself as the fraud investigation gained public momentum none of them could contain anymore. I felt no satisfaction watching a marriage potentially crumble, only a grim confirmation that everything Ruth's financial records suggested had been real. Money, deception, and desperation had apparently poisoned every corner of Marlene's life. Not just her presidency of an HOA nobody outside Cedar Ridge had ever heard of before. The full hearing arrived on a cold morning in late November. I sat beside Ellis, folder in hand, 18 months of careful documentation finally about to matter in front of a judge who'd shown little patience for Cedar Ridge's excuses throughout the entire drawn-out, exhausting legal process leading here. Marlene's attorney opened weakly, still clinging to the prescriptive easement theory despite mounting evidence contradicting it at every turn. The judge interrupted twice, asking pointed questions about the missing county permit and the forged surveyor signature that Detective Reyes's investigation had already conclusively proven fraudulent months earlier. Ellis presented our case methodically, walking through the deed history, the fabricated documents, the sabotage footage, and Ruth's financial records showing Marlene's undisclosed stake in the stalled development. Every piece connected into a single damning narrative the judge seemed to absorb with growing visible disapproval throughout the morning. When Ellis called the retired county surveyor to testify, confirming under oath his signature had been digitally stolen and never authorized, I watched something shift permanently in the courtroom. Marlene's face, usually so composed, went pale. Her attorney scribbled frantic notes, clearly realizing the case had become unwinnable in real time. The judge ruled from the bench that afternoon, an unusual move signaling how clear-cut she found the evidence. She granted permanent injunction against any further construction, ordered the illegal road removed and the land restored at Cedar Ridge's expense, and dismissed the fraudulent lien against my property entirely. More significantly, she referred the forged surveyor signature and fabricated county permit directly to the district attorney's office for criminal review, stacking on to whatever charges Detective Reyes's fraud investigation was already preparing. Marlene walked out of that courthouse facing exposure on nearly every front simultaneously now. I should have felt pure relief, and mostly I did, but I also understood this wasn't truly over yet. Marlene had proven repeatedly she wouldn't simply accept defeat gracefully. Whatever desperation drove her this far wasn't likely to evaporate just because a judge ruled decisively against her that afternoon. Cedar Ridge's board, watching their president's legal foundation collapse publicly, called an emergency session that same week. Ruth texted updates throughout, describing a room full of homeowners finally furious, demanding answers about the special assessment, the consulting payments, and exactly how much of their money Marlene had spent defending indefensible actions. Marlene, cornered for the first time in front of people who'd once trusted her completely, reportedly broke down mid-meeting, alternating between tearful apology and defensive accusations against outside forces conspiring against her. Several board members, including Alan, moved immediately to initiate formal removal proceedings against her presidency that very night. I felt a strange mixture of vindication and exhaustion reading Ruth's updates. 18 months of my life had been consumed defending land my family held peacefully for 6 decades. All because one woman decided her ambitions mattered more than the truth, the law, or the people she claimed to represent. The removal vote happened 3 days later, overwhelming and swift, for 100 families finally seeing clearly what Ruth, Alan, and I had understood for months. Marlene was stripped of her HOA presidency immediately, though the criminal investigations, both fraud and forgery, continued moving forward entirely separate from any community vote. I thought, briefly, that removing her from power might soften whatever fight remained in Marlene. I was wrong. Weeks later, with news that changed the entire shape of what came next. Marlene, facing imminent arrest, had made one final desperate move nobody saw coming. She'd quietly transferred the shell company holding her interest in the stalled development to an offshore account, attempting to shield assets before formal charges could freeze them. Reyes said it was a common but foolish move, one that typically backfired badly once prosecutors noticed the suspicious timing surrounding it. More alarmingly, Reyes mentioned Marlene had been seen at a title company office inquiring about the second phase development plans, as though she still believed, even now, that finishing the road across my land remained somehow possible. Her obsession with that project had clearly become untethered from any rational assessment. I doubled security around my property immediately, extra cameras, motion lights along the entire fence line, a renewed vigilance I'd hoped was finally behind me. Ellis warned that cornered people sometimes grew more dangerous, not less, especially when their entire identity had been built around control they were rapidly losing. 2 nights later, my cameras caught movement near the north gate again, though this time it wasn't a landscaping crew. A single figure, moving carefully with a flashlight, walked the length of my fence line, studying it closely before disappearing into the darkness toward the unfinished, court-ordered removal road. I sent the footage immediately to Detective Reyes, who confirmed what I already suspected. The build, the walk, the deliberate care. It matched Marlene's general height and movement from previous community event footage. She was scouting my property personally now, though for what exact purpose remained unclear and deeply unsettling. Ellis suggested this behavior, desperate and increasingly erratic, might actually strengthen any future restraining order request. Evidence Marlene couldn't accept the court's ruling and continued trespassing despite facing serious criminal exposure already. We filed for an emergency personal restraining order the very next morning without hesitation. The judge granted it swiftly, adding Marlene's name specifically to a list of individuals barred from approaching my property under any circumstances. I felt a small measure of protection restored, though the underlying unease never fully left me during those tense, uncertain weeks following her removal from HOA leadership. Cedar Ridge, meanwhile, faced its own reckoning beyond just Marlene's downfall. The new interim board, with Alan now serving as acting president, launched a full financial audit of the special assessment funds, uncovering discrepancies stretching back nearly 2 years, far beyond what Ruth's initial documents had even suggested. Homeowners who'd defended Marlene most fiercely during the community meetings grew notably quiet as audit findings trickled out publicly. It's easier to champion a cause when you believe the person leading it. Harder when mounting evidence reveals exactly how thoroughly you'd been misled the entire time. I received an unexpected letter that week from several Cedar Ridge residents. A formal apology for the flyers, the Facebook group, the mailbox vandalism, acknowledging they'd believed Marlene's version of events without ever verifying it themselves. It didn't erase the damage, but it meant more than I expected it to. Ellis, reviewing the criminal case developments with Reyes, learned the district attorney planned to pursue felony charges covering document forgery, criminal trespass, and financial fraud, with additional charges possible pending the offshore transfer investigation. Marlene's arrest, once merely anticipated, was now scheduled within the coming 2 weeks. I found myself thinking about Gerald often during that period, wondering how much he'd truly known versus simply benefited from without asking questions. Ruth mentioned he'd hired his own separate attorney, apparently distancing himself legally from Marlene entirely, perhaps sensing his own exposure if her fraud proved deep enough. The stalled second phase development, once Marlene's secret motivation for everything, quietly collapsed once her shell company's involvement became public record. The original developer, embarrassed by association, issued a statement distancing the company entirely from any knowledge of Marlene's undisclosed financial stake in blocked, contested land access. I visited the still unrepaired road that week, gravel scarring my northeast pasture, waiting for Cedar Ridge to fulfill the court's restoration order. Standing there, I realized how strange it felt that so much destruction, so many months of fear and exhaustion, had all stemmed from one woman's hidden financial ambition. Ellis warned the restoration process would likely stall further, since Cedar Ridge's frozen legal fund, tied up in the fraud investigation, left the new interim board scrambling to find money for court-ordered repairs they'd never budgeted for under Marlene's previous, deliberately opaque financial management of community resources. I told Ellis I didn't particularly care how they funded it, only that it happened. The land deserved to heal from what had been done to it. My grandfather's creek crossing restored to the quiet, undisturbed place it had been for 60 years before Marlene decided she needed it for herself. Marlene's arrest happened on a Thursday morning, quiet compared to everything preceding it. No dramatic scene, just 2 detectives arriving at what remained of her house. Gerald already gone, the driveway empty except for her car. Ruth texted me a single photo from a distance, and I finally exhaled fully. I didn't celebrate exactly, though I won't pretend I felt nothing watching that arrest unfold secondhand through Ruth's photos. Mostly I felt tired. The particular exhaustion of someone who'd spent 18 months defending something that should never have required defending in the first place against basic, obvious truth. Emily flew home that weekend, and we sat on the porch together as evening settled over the ranch. The same porch where Carol and I used to watch sunsets years earlier. I told her everything, start to finish, and she listened quietly, occasionally shaking her head at the sheer audacity involved. "You should sell it," Emily said eventually, surprising me. "Not out of defeat," she clarified, "but strategy." If Cedar Ridge's second phase development depended entirely on access through my land, and I sold to someone who'd never grant that access, the whole scheme would die permanently, regardless of who led the HOA next. I turned the idea over for days, walking the fence line each morning, remembering everything this land represented. My father, my grandfather, decades of quiet, honest work. Selling felt like surrender at first. But slowly, I started seeing it differently, not as giving up, but as delivering the final, permanent blow. Marlene's criminal case moved through arraignment while I considered Emily's suggestion. Released on bail, she reportedly remained defiant, giving a brief statement to local news insisting she'd always acted in the community's best interest. A claim so detached from reality it barely registered as surprising anymore. Cedar Ridge's interim board, desperate to distance the community from Marlene's scandal, reached out formally requesting a meeting, hoping to negotiate some legitimate access agreement now that the fraudulent claims had collapsed entirely. I agreed to hear them out, mostly out of curiosity about their approach. Alan led the meeting professionally, apologizing sincerely for everything the community had put me through, offering fair market compensation for a legitimate easement this time, properly surveyed, properly voted, properly compensated. It was everything Marlene should have offered from the very beginning. 18 months and 1 felony arrest too late. I appreciated the sincerity, genuinely, but told them I needed time to consider it. Something had shifted in me over those 18 months, a hardened resolve that no amount of belated politeness could fully soften. Trust, once shattered that thoroughly, doesn't rebuild itself in a single well-mannered meeting. Marlene, awaiting trial, launched one final desperate maneuver, filing a countersuit against me personally, claiming defamation over statements Ellis had made publicly during court proceedings. Her new attorney, clearly less confident than her previous legal team, filed it almost reflexively, the legal equivalent of a drowning woman grasping at anything floating. Ellis dismissed the countersuit's chances immediately, noting truthful statements made during legal proceedings enjoyed strong protection, regardless of how damaging they felt to Marlene's reputation. Still, it meant additional weeks of legal maneuvering, additional reminders that this woman's capacity for desperate escalation hadn't fully exhausted itself yet. I started seriously researching potential buyers during that period. Not out of financial need. The ranch remained profitable enough, but out of Emily's earlier suggestion taking firmer root in my thinking. If selling could permanently sever Cedar Ridge's access hopes, it felt worth exploring seriously and carefully. Ellis connected me with a commercial real estate attorney experienced in large land transactions, someone who understood exactly how to structure a sale that would legally and permanently extinguish any lingering easement claims or development access hopes, regardless of who eventually purchased Cedar Ridge's adjacent property in the future. Word apparently reached Marlene, even out on bail, that I was exploring a sale. Ruth heard through the Cedar Ridge grapevine that Marlene had grown increasingly agitated, telling anyone who'd listen that selling the land would be an act of spite, designed purely to punish an innocent community. The irony of Marlene accusing me of spite, after everything she'd orchestrated against me, would have been almost funny if it weren't so exhausting. I'd spent 18 months simply trying to protect what my family built. Any consequences Cedar Ridge now faced stemmed entirely from her own choices, not mine. My real estate attorney identified a promising buyer within weeks. An out-of-state timber and land investment company with no interest whatsoever in residential development access, only in the ranch's grazing and timber value. They had no reason to ever grant Cedar Ridge the road access Marlene had wanted so desperately. I met with their representative, a straightforward woman named Patricia Kwan, who reviewed the property thoroughly and confirmed her company's plans involved sustainable timber harvesting and cattle leasing, nothing resembling residential access roads. She seemed almost amused hearing the full saga once I explained why I was finally considering selling. Patricia's company offered a fair price, more than fair given current land values, and crucially agreed to a sale structure permanently extinguishing any potential easement. Claims through explicit deed language Ellis and my real estate attorney drafted with extraordinary care to close every possible loophole Marlene's people might exploit later. I still hesitated, walking the property one final time before deciding anything definite, remembering every corner of land I'd known my entire life. But I kept returning to Emily's point. This wasn't really about the land anymore. It was about ensuring Marlene's scheme died completely, permanently, beyond any future revival. Marlene's trial date arrived before I finalized any sale, a proceeding that drew significant local attention given how publicly the whole saga had played out across Cedar Ridge and beyond. I attended most sessions, sitting quietly in the back, watching the prosecution methodically present 18 months of accumulated evidence. The retired surveyor testified again, more forcefully this time, describing his fury discovering his professional reputation stolen for fraudulent purposes. The landscaping foreman confirmed Marlene's direct orders to proceed without permits. Ruth's financial documents, entered as exhibits, painted a damning picture of systematic fraud spanning nearly 2 years. Marlene's defense attempted arguing diminished culpability, suggesting she genuinely believed her actions served the community's greater good, that her judgment had simply become clouded by devotion to Cedar Ridge. The prosecution countered sharply, pointing to the offshore asset transfer as clear evidence of calculated, self-interested criminal intent throughout. I testified on the third day, describing the cut fences, the stray cattle fines, the mailbox vandalism, the fraudulent lien, the sleepless nights spent wondering what Marlene would do next. It felt strange finally saying it all aloud in a courtroom, after so long fighting it largely through paperwork and patience. Marlene watched me testify without expression. None of the tearful performances she'd delivered during Cedar Ridge community meetings months earlier. Perhaps she understood, finally, that this particular audience couldn't be swayed by calculated emotion the way frightened, dues-paying homeowners once had been throughout her presidency. The jury deliberated for just under 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on every major charge: forgery, criminal trespass, and financial fraud, though the offshore transfer investigation remained ongoing separately under federal jurisdiction given the international banking elements involved in her attempted asset concealment scheme. Sentencing was scheduled for several weeks later, giving both sides time to prepare statements. I decided, after significant thought, to write a victim impact statement, something I'd never imagined doing when this all began with a simple letter asking permission to survey my northeast property corner 18 months earlier. In the meantime, I finalized the sale to Patricia's company, signing documents that permanently transferred my family's 2,300 acres, effective the following spring after final regulatory approvals cleared. Every clause explicitly extinguished any development access rights, sealing shut the door Marlene had tried so desperately to force open. Cedar Ridge's interim board, learning of the impending sale, reached out one final time, hoping the new owners might reconsider some access arrangement. I forwarded their inquiry to Patricia, fully expecting the answer I received. Her company had zero interest in residential development partnerships, only timber and grazing operations. Permanently, Ruth called when news of the sale spread through Cedar Ridge, describing a community finally forced to confront what Marlene's ambitions had actually cost them, not just financially through legal fees and fraud losses, but permanently through a sealed access route that would never reopen regardless of future leadership. I felt no guilt hearing that reaction. Cedar Ridge had a functional entrance road for 15 years before any of this started. Their inconvenience during rare spring floods never justified forged documents, sabotage, or financial fraud. Whatever difficulty they now faced permanently, they'd built entirely through their own community's failed choices. Marlene's sentencing arrived on a gray morning in early spring. The courthouse steps crowded with local news cameras given how thoroughly the story had captured regional attention. I stood beside Ellis, my victim impact statement folded carefully in my jacket pocket, ready for whatever came next. The judge listened to statements from several affected parties. Ruth describing retaliation for cooperation, Alan describing manipulated board finances, the retired surveyor describing stolen professional identity. Then I stood, reading through 18 months compressed into a few careful pages, describing not just damage to property, but damage to trust itself. I spoke about my grandfather's creek crossing, my father's clean deed, the quiet decades before Marlene decided ambition mattered more than honesty. I spoke about sleepless nights, cut fences, stray cattle fines, and a fraudulent lien threatening land my family protected across 3 generations of careful, honest stewardship. Marlene showed no visible reaction throughout my statement, staring straight ahead with the same rigid composure she'd maintained throughout most of the trial. Whatever remained of the confident, commanding HOA president who'd once stood before 400 families had clearly been replaced by something hollowed out and exhausted. The judge, weighing everything presented, handed down a sentence combining significant prison time with substantial financial restitution owed both to me and to Cedar Ridge's defrauded homeowners collectively, acknowledging the calculated, sustained nature of Marlene's crimes rather than treating them as isolated impulsive decisions. I felt something release in my chest hearing that sentence read aloud. 18 months of accumulated tension finally finding some measure of resolution. It wouldn't undo the damage completely. Restitution rarely does. But it represented something I desperately needed. Acknowledgement from the system itself that what happened to me mattered. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked for comment. I kept it brief, saying only that the truth eventually surfaces regardless of how thoroughly someone tries burying it, and that I hoped Cedar Ridge could rebuild genuine trust within their community now that Marlene's manufactured version of events had fully collapsed. Ruth found me afterward, hugging me tightly, thanking me for refusing to back down when so much pressure pushed toward exactly that outcome. I told her the truth. I couldn't have done it without her financial records, without Ellis's patience, without Detective Reyes's genuine investigative diligence throughout the process. Alan, now Cedar Ridge's permanent elected president following a proper community vote, reached out weeks later describing reforms implemented to prevent any future president from wielding unchecked power the way Marlene had. Financial transparency requirements, mandatory board votes for major expenditures, real accountability structures finally taking root. I appreciated hearing that, genuinely hoping Cedar Ridge could heal from what happened, even knowing my own connection to the community was ending permanently through the land sale already in progress. Some wounds, even properly treated, simply require distance and time rather than continued proximity to fully close. Patricia's company finalized their acquisition that spring, and I spent my final weeks on the ranch walking every acre one last time, saying a quiet goodbye to land holding 60 years of family history. Felt bittersweet, but also strangely peaceful, knowing exactly why this ending had become necessary. I kept a small parcel near the homestead itself, 5 acres including the house Carol and I raised Emily in, negotiated separately from the larger sale. I wasn't leaving entirely, just releasing the vast majority of contested land to owners who'd never grant Cedar Ridge the access they'd fought so hard for. The illegal road, still unrepaired despite the court order, became Patricia's company's problem to resolve now. One final complication Cedar Ridge's fraud drained. Legal fund would need to address with an entirely new landowner uninterested in negotiating any favors regarding a road nobody legitimately needed in the first place. Emily visited during my final weeks on the larger property, and we walked the creek crossing together one last time, the place where this entire saga began 18 months earlier. "Grandpa would be proud of how you fought this," she said quietly, and I finally let myself believe that fully. Marlene, meanwhile, began serving her sentence at a state facility several hours away. Her presidency, her marriage, and her financial security all completely dismantled by choices she'd made pursuing a development scheme built entirely on forged documents and fabricated legal claims nobody outside her inner circle ever fully questioned. Gerald filed for divorce shortly after sentencing, distancing himself legally and financially from whatever remained of Marlene's collapsed empire. I felt nothing toward him particularly, understanding he'd made his own complicated choices throughout this entire saga, choices that were ultimately his own to answer for, not mine to judge harshly. Cedar Ridge's second phase development. The entire motivation behind Marlene's year-long campaign against me died permanently once the land sale finalized. The original developer quietly abandoned the project altogether, unwilling to pursue anything connected to such a publicly documented fraud scandal, regardless of whatever legitimate access might theoretically exist elsewhere. I sat with Ellis one final time to review remaining legal matters, the restitution collection process, the completed land transfer, the closed criminal case. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that Marlene's appeal attempts had been denied twice already, the evidence simply too overwhelming to overturn on any technical grounds. Selling the ranch, even for the right reasons, left me with an unexpected grief I hadn't fully anticipated. I mourned not just the land itself, but the version of my life that existed before Marlene decided ambition mattered more than honesty, before 18 months of fighting became my daily reality. Ruth visited my remaining 5 acres often during that transition period, bringing coffee, sitting on the porch, helping me process everything that happened. She admitted feeling guilty sometimes, wondering if she'd spoken up sooner, whether any of this could have been prevented entirely before it escalated so dramatically. I told her the guilt belonged entirely to Marlene, not to anyone who simply feared the consequences of challenging someone who'd systematically built a culture of intimidation throughout Cedar Ridge. Fear, however understandable, wasn't the crime here. Forgery, sabotage, and fraud were, and only one person committed those particular crimes. Detective Reyes stopped by unexpectedly one afternoon, off duty, simply wanting to check in given how personally invested she'd become throughout the lengthy investigation. She mentioned the federal offshore transfer case against Marlene remained ongoing, likely adding additional years to her eventual total sentence once fully resolved through separate proceedings. I thanked Reyes sincerely for treating my case seriously when others initially hadn't, remembering those early frustrating weeks when deputies seemed reluctant to intervene against an HOA president with apparent influence somewhere within the local system. Her genuine diligence had ultimately made all the difference in reaching real accountability. Patricia's company began sustainable timber operations that summer, hiring local workers, maintaining the land responsibly in ways that honored, in their own commercial fashion, the careful stewardship my family practiced for generations. I found some comfort watching the land continue thriving under new ownership, even without my direct hands involved. I started spending more time with Emily, visiting her at school, rebuilding the closeness 18 months of legal chaos had inadvertently strained. She'd grown remarkably during this period, watching her father navigate sustained injustice with patience and persistence rather than bitterness. Lessons I hoped would serve her throughout her own life. Cedar Ridge's community, under Alan's more transparent leadership, slowly began rebuilding genuine trust internally. Homeowners' meetings running longer but more honestly. Financial records finally open for anyone to review. Ruth mentioned it felt like an entirely different community now, one actually functioning the way HOAs were originally intended to operate. I received a letter from Alan that autumn, formally thanking me on behalf of Cedar Ridge's homeowners for pursuing justice even when it would have been easier, certainly less exhausting, to simply settle quietly and disappear from the conflict entirely months earlier when Gerald first offered his suspicious payout. I wrote back, telling Alan I never fought for Cedar Ridge specifically, only for the simple principle that land ownership meant something, that forged documents and manufactured fear couldn't override 60 years of honest family stewardship regardless of how confidently someone claimed otherwise from a position of assumed authority. Marlene's restitution payments began arriving slowly through the court-ordered process. Small amounts given her limited resources from prison, but symbolically significant regardless of the actual dollar figures involved. Ellis said full restitution would likely take years, possibly extending well beyond her eventual release date from state custody. I didn't need the money particularly. The land sale had provided more than enough financial security for whatever remained of my life. But accepting the restitution felt important anyway. A formal acknowledgement maintained through the system that what happened to me carried real, measurable consequences worth enforcing consistently over time. Winter arrived quietly on my remaining 5 acres. The first season in 60 years my family didn't own the surrounding 2,300 acres that once defined our entire livelihood. Felt strange, smaller somehow, but also unexpectedly peaceful, free from the constant vigilance those final 18 months demanded. I heard through Ruth that Cedar Ridge's original entrance road finally received proper county funding for flood mitigation improvements, the actual solution that should have addressed their access concerns from the very beginning, without ever requiring forged permits, illegal construction, or any of Marlene's elaborate fraudulent scheming whatsoever. That news landed with particular irony. A legitimate engineering solution existed the entire time, addressing Cedar Ridge's genuine flooding concerns without ever touching my family's land. Marlene simply preferred a path benefiting her own hidden financial interests over the straightforward solution actually serving her community's stated needs honestly. Emily graduated that spring, and I sat in the audience feeling Carol's absence acutely, wishing she could witness how thoroughly our daughter had grown into someone thoughtful, resilient, and grounded despite watching her father navigate 18 exhausting months of manufactured conflict during some of her most formative college years. Afterward, Emily asked whether I regretted selling the larger property, whether some part of me wished I'd fought to keep every acre rather than releasing most of it to Patricia's company. I told her honestly that regret never really entered into it, only relief that the fight finally ended permanently. I started volunteering occasionally at the County Land Trust that year, sharing my own experience with other rural landowners facing similar development pressures, offering guidance born from 18 months of hard-won, expensive lessons about protecting family land against determined, well-funded opposition using manufactured legal claims and manipulated community narratives. Ruth mentioned Marlene's appeal had been denied a final time that summer, exhausting every available legal avenue, leaving her sentence fully intact without further recourse. Whatever remained of her ambitions, her marriage, her reputation, and her freedom now existed entirely within the consequences her own choices had constructed methodically. I thought about Marlene less often as time passed, though certain moments still triggered memories. Driving past the old ranch entrance, seeing Cedar Ridge's gate from the county road, hearing Ruth mention updates from the community she still called home despite everything that transpired there over those difficult months. Patricia's company invited me to visit occasionally, and I took them up on it once that autumn, walking the creek crossing again as a guest rather than an owner. Felt different, complicated, but also appropriately closed. A chapter finished completely rather than lingering unresolved the way it easily could have. I told Patricia's site manager the history of that particular crossing. My grandfather's original homestead marker still standing nearby, protected now through the sale agreements. Specific preservation clause Ellis had insisted upon during negotiations, ensuring at least that small piece of family history remained undisturbed regardless of future development. Ellis called occasionally just to check in, no longer discussing active legal matters but simply maintaining the friendship built through 18 intense months working closely together. He mentioned Marlene's case had become something of a cautionary example locally, HOA boards elsewhere reportedly implementing new transparency measures after hearing details. I found some satisfaction in that unexpected legacy, knowing my exhausting fight had inadvertently protected other landowners and homeowners from similar schemes elsewhere, communities strengthening their own financial oversight after witnessing exactly how catastrophically things could unravel when unchecked power concentrated within a single determined, dishonest person's hands. Detective Reyes received a promotion that year, partly attributed to her diligent handling of increasingly complex financial fraud cases following Marlene's conviction, cases that apparently gained her department's attention as models for how thorough, patient investigation could successfully untangle sophisticated schemes hiding behind seemingly mundane community organizations. I attended her promotion ceremony when invited, Genuinely proud watching someone who'd treated my case seriously from the very beginning receive recognition for exactly the qualities that mattered most throughout this entire ordeal: persistence, attention to detail, and a refusal to dismiss complaints simply because they seemed complicated. Ruth's own HOA dues normalized eventually once Cedar Ridge's finances were properly audited and corrected. The punitive tripling Marlene imposed during the investigation reversed entirely under Alan's more honest leadership. She mentioned feeling, for the first time in years, like Cedar Ridge actually belonged to its residents again collectively. I spent that second winter settling fully into life on my remaining 5 acres, smaller but entirely mine, free from any lingering legal battles or manufactured community drama. The quiet felt earned after everything, a peace I'd fought harder for than I ever imagined necessary when this all began. Emily visited for the holidays, and we spent evenings reviewing old family photographs. My father and grandfather working land that now belonged to Patricia's timber company. It felt melancholy but also appropriately honest, acknowledging both what was lost and what had been necessarily protected through difficult, deliberate choices. I received one final letter from Marlene that winter, forwarded through the prison's official correspondence system. An attempt at some kind of apology mixed uncomfortably with continued justification for her actions. I read it once, felt nothing resembling forgiveness stirring within me, and filed it away permanently unanswered. Some wrongs I'd come to understand throughout this entire exhausting ordeal didn't require my forgiveness to reach genuine resolution. The legal system had already delivered its verdict. My own peace came not from absolving Marlene of anything, but simply from no longer allowing her actions to define my daily existence. 2 years after the sale finalized, I received an unexpected call from Patricia herself, her voice carrying an urgency I hadn't heard from her before. Someone, she explained carefully, had approached her company's board directly, attempting to purchase development rights to a small portion of land near the original creek crossing. My stomach tightened immediately. Patricia continued explaining that the buyer, operating through yet another shell company, seemed suspiciously determined to acquire access specifically through that same northeast corner where the illegal road once stood, the exact location Marlene had fought so desperately, illegally, to secure years earlier. Patricia's legal team had grown curious enough to investigate the shell company's ownership structure themselves, discovering threads leading back toward Gerald, Marlene's ex-husband, apparently attempting to quietly revive the stalled development scheme years after his ex-wife's spectacular, very public downfall had seemingly ended it permanently for good. I called Ellis immediately, feeling that familiar cold dread returning after years of relative peace. He confirmed Gerald had indeed remained financially connected to certain development interests, apparently believing enough time had passed that nobody would remember or care about the original scheme's fraudulent, criminal origins anymore. Ellis reviewed the original sale agreement carefully, confirming the access extinguishing language remained airtight regardless of who now approached Patricia's company. Gerald's attempted purchase, whatever his intentions, legally couldn't grant the residential development access his ex-wife's original scheme had depended upon so completely years before everything collapsed. Still, the attempt itself felt like an unwelcome echo, proof that some ambitions never truly die, only wait patiently for circumstances to shift favorably again. I asked Patricia to formally decline any further discussion with Gerald's shell company, unwilling to let this particular door reopen even slightly after everything endured. Patricia agreed immediately, mentioning her company had zero interest in residential development partnerships regardless of who approached them, timber and grazing operations remaining their exclusive long-term plan for the property. Still, she promised to alert me immediately if similar approaches occurred again from any direction whatsoever going forward. Ruth, hearing about Gerald's attempt, mentioned Cedar Ridge's current leadership under Allen remained completely uninvolved and unaware, the HOA itself having no connection to whatever Gerald was privately attempting to arrange years after his divorce and his ex-wife's very public criminal conviction for related fraudulent activities. I felt reassured somewhat by that distinction, understanding this wasn't Cedar Ridge collectively trying anything improper again. Simply one desperate, apparently unreformed, individual still chasing a financial windfall his ex-wife's original scheme had promised before forged documents and fabricated permits destroyed everything she'd built around it. Detective Reyes, now working in a different division but still occasionally consulting on complex fraud cases, offered to review Gerald's shell company activities informally, curious whether his attempted purchase might connect to unresolved elements from the original federal investigation into Marlene's offshore asset transfers years earlier. Her review uncovered something significant. Gerald had apparently maintained access to funds Marlene originally hid offshore, funds the federal investigation hadn't fully recovered during the original case, now quietly being deployed toward this renewed attempt at reviving the development scheme through legally distinct but practically connected channels. This discovery reopened the federal case against Marlene's hidden assets, now expanding to examine Gerald's potential involvement in concealing marital fraud proceeds during their divorce proceedings, proceeds that legally should have been included in the restitution calculations determined during her original criminal sentencing years earlier entirely. I felt a strange sense of history repeating itself, watching another investigation slowly build against another member of the same family, driven by the same underlying ambition to profit from land access that legally, permanently, no longer existed following the ironclad sale agreement Ellis had drafted so carefully years before. Gerald, apparently sensing renewed scrutiny, attempted contacting me directly again, this time through a formal letter rather than an unannounced visit, proposing a fresh start. Negotiation regarding potential access arrangements that conveniently ignored the extinguished easement rights and the ongoing federal investigation into his own financial conduct. I forwarded his letter immediately to both Ellis and Detective Reyes without responding personally, unwilling to engage directly with anyone attempting to revive a scheme built entirely on his ex-wife's proven criminal fraud. Some doors, once closed this thoroughly, deserved to remain permanently shut regardless of who kept knocking. Ellis confirmed Gerald's letter itself provided useful evidence for the expanding federal investigation, demonstrating continued active interest in reviving the fraudulent development scheme years after its original collapse, suggesting financial motivation strong enough to risk further legal exposure despite everything his ex-wife had already suffered through prosecution. Federal investigators, building their expanded case throughout that year, eventually traced substantial hidden funds Gerald had quietly maintained access to since the divorce, money that should have factored into both the original restitution calculations and the marital asset division proceedings that concluded years earlier without full financial transparency. I learned through Ellis that federal charges against Gerald were being prepared separately, focused specifically on concealing assets during a federal investigation and attempting to obstruct ongoing restitution collection efforts related to Marlene's original criminal case, serious charges carrying their own significant potential prison exposure independently. Ruth, following developments closely through her continued Cedar Ridge connections, mentioned the renewed scandal had reignited significant local interest in the entire saga. Community members who'd mostly moved past the original conflict suddenly reminded of exactly how thoroughly deception had once infiltrated their neighborhood's leadership structure. I found myself giving another statement to federal investigators that autumn, describing Gerald's various attempts at contact, his suspicious behavior during the original investigation, and this renewed effort to revive development access years after everything should have concluded permanently following his ex-wife's comprehensive criminal conviction. The federal case against Gerald moved considerably faster than Marlene's original state prosecution, financial paper trails proving significantly easier to establish once investigators knew specifically where and how to look. Following threads Reyes's informal review had initially uncovered during her curious, off-duty examination of the shell company, Gerald was formally charged that winter with concealing assets from federal investigators and attempting to obstruct court-ordered restitution collection. Charges he initially attempted, fighting through expensive legal representation before ultimately accepting a plea agreement once the financial evidence proved simply too overwhelming to credibly contest any further. His plea agreement required full disclosure and surrender of the previously hidden offshore funds, money that would now properly flow toward completing Marlene's outstanding restitution obligations to both myself and Cedar Ridge's originally defrauded homeowners, finally closing a financial gap that had lingered unresolved for years. I received notification of a substantial additional restitution payment that spring, funds recovered specifically through Gerald's plea agreement, a final unexpected chapter in a saga I genuinely believed concluded years earlier when I first signed the original land sale documents transferring most of my family's ranch permanently away. Emily, now working in her own career, called when she heard the news, marveling at how thoroughly this entire situation kept resurfacing across the years. Ambition and greed, apparently proving remarkably persistent even after such comprehensive, publicly documented consequences had already befallen everyone directly involved in the original scheme. I told her I'd stopped being surprised by any of it, understanding now that people convinced of their own entitlement to something rarely abandon that conviction easily, regardless of criminal convictions, financial ruin, or divorce proceedings that should have thoroughly demonstrated the futility of continuing to pursue it. Cedar Ridge's current leadership, under Allen's continued careful stewardship, issued a formal statement distancing the community entirely from Gerald's renewed scheme, emphasizing the extensive financial reforms implemented years earlier specifically to prevent any individual, regardless of connection to previous leadership, from manipulating community resources for personal gain again. I appreciated that transparency. Watching Cedar Ridge continue demonstrating genuine accountability years after Marlene's original downfall first forced the community toward meaningful structural change. Whatever damage her presidency originally caused, something legitimately better had gradually grown from the wreckage through sustained, deliberate institutional reform. Detective Reyes, now senior within her fraud division, mentioned this expanded case had become something of a teaching example for newer investigators, demonstrating how patient, methodical financial investigation could eventually unravel even sophisticated attempts at concealment spanning years and multiple family members working together. I visited the original creek crossing one final time that spring, walking Patricia's company's land as an invited guest, watching sustainable timber operations continuing responsibly across acres my family once called entirely their own. The homestead marker still stood protected, exactly as the preservation clause guaranteed years earlier. Standing there, I finally felt something resembling complete closure, watching land that caused so much prolonged suffering now simply existing peacefully, productively, permanently beyond the reach of anyone's fraudulent development ambitions. 2 separate criminal cases, 2 family members convicted, and finally, genuinely, nothing left to fight over anymore. Ellis called that summer with final confirmation that Gerald's completed sentence, combined with Marlene's original restitution obligations, had fully satisfied every financial judgment against the family stemming from this entire multi-year saga. Every legal thread, finally, comprehensively, permanently resolved after everything endured across the preceding several years. I felt genuine relief hearing that final confirmation, understanding this particular chapter of my life had truly, completely concluded now. No more court dates, no more federal investigations, no more suspicious shell companies attempting to revive schemes that should have died the moment forged documents were first discovered years earlier. Ruth, still my closest connection to Cedar Ridge despite years passing since I'd sold most of my original land, mentioned the community continued thriving under transparent leadership. The second phase development permanently abandoned. The original entrance road properly renovated through legitimate county flood mitigation funding years earlier. I thought often, during this final quiet period, about how differently everything might have unfolded had Marlene simply pursued legitimate channels from the very beginning, formally requesting an easement, offering fair compensation, respecting my initial refusal rather than escalating toward forgery, sabotage, and elaborate financial fraud instead. But ambition unchecked by honesty rarely chooses the difficult, legitimate path when shortcuts appear available, and Marlene's entire downfall stemmed precisely from that fundamental character flaw, believing her own convenience justified whatever deception proved necessary to achieve it, regardless of consequences to anyone standing genuinely in her way. Emily visited that autumn, and we walked my remaining 5 acres together, discussing how thoroughly this entire experience had shaped both our lives across the preceding years. She mentioned considering law school eventually, inspired partly by watching Ellis navigate such complex, sustained litigation with patient, unwavering determination throughout. I felt proud hearing that, understanding something genuinely meaningful had emerged from years of exhausting conflict. My daughter finding purpose partly through witnessing how the legal system, however slow and imperfect at times, could eventually deliver genuine accountability when pursued patiently, thoroughly, and honestly across sustained effort. Patricia's company invited me to a small ceremony that winter, dedicating a protected conservation easement across the creek crossing area permanently, ensuring the land my grandfather, once homesteaded, would remain undeveloped indefinitely regardless of future ownership changes. A fitting permanent resolution to everything that transpired there previously. I stood at that ceremony feeling my father and grandfather's presence somehow, understanding this particular piece of land now carried protections stronger than anything Marlene's forged documents or Gerald's shell companies could ever threaten again. A permanent legal shield against exactly the kind of scheme that once nearly consumed everything. Detective Reyes attended that ceremony too, having become something of a friend across the years spent working this case together. She mentioned feeling genuine satisfaction watching such a thorough, complicated saga reach such a definitively positive conclusion. Unlike many cases that simply faded unresolved through prosecutorial exhaustion or resource limitations. Ruth attended as well, representing Cedar Ridge's continued goodwill toward me despite the community's complicated history throughout this entire saga. She mentioned Alan's leadership had recently been re-elected unanimously, homeowners genuinely satisfied with the transparent, honest governance structure implemented following Marlene's spectacular original downfall years earlier. I gave brief remarks at the ceremony, keeping them simple, thanking everyone who'd supported me across years of sustained conflict, acknowledging my family's land now existed permanently protected, and expressing quiet hope that Cedar Ridge and I could finally move forward as genuinely peaceful, respectful neighbors going forward. That evening, after the ceremony concluded, Ellis handed me one final document, the completed federal case file confirming every financial thread connected to Marlene and Gerald's combined fraudulent scheme had been fully investigated, prosecuted, and resolved, closing the books permanently on this extraordinary multi-year saga entirely. I read through it slowly that night, remembering every stage across the years. The first survey stakes appearing near the creek, the bulldozers arriving overnight, the forged permits, the sabotaged fences, the courtroom testimonies, the eventual convictions, and finally, this permanent conservation protection securing everything against future threats. Marlene, I later learned through Ruth's continued Cedar Ridge connections, remained incarcerated with her sentence extended somewhat following additional charges connected to the federal investigation into Gerald's concealed assets, charges relating to her own knowledge and participation in hiding marital funds from original restitution calculations years earlier. Gerald, having served his own separate sentence for obstruction and asset concealment, apparently relocated out of state entirely following his release, severing whatever remaining connections existed to Cedar Ridge or the development scheme that had consumed and ultimately destroyed both his marriage and his professional reputation completely. I felt no particular satisfaction learning these details, only a settled sense that justice, however slow and complicated across multiple overlapping cases, had ultimately reached appropriate, proportionate conclusions for everyone whose deliberate choices caused such extensive, sustained harm to myself, my family, and Cedar Ridge's broader community throughout. Emily, now genuinely considering law school seriously, asked me once whether I harbored lingering anger toward Marlene and Gerald despite everything finally reaching resolution. I told her honestly that anger had mostly faded, replaced by something closer to weary understanding about how far unchecked ambition could travel unchecked. Ruth mentioned occasionally that Cedar Ridge residents still discussed the saga sometimes, using it as a cautionary reference whenever any community decision seemed to concentrate too much unchecked authority within a single leader's hands again. A permanent lesson embedded into the neighborhood's institutional memory going forward. I appreciated that legacy, understanding my exhausting, multi-year fight had ultimately protected not just my own family's land, but reshaped how an entire community approached governance, transparency, and accountability going forward. A meaningful outcome emerging from what began as simple stubborn refusal to surrender land under false pretenses. Patricia's company continued their sustainable operations across my former ranch land, occasionally inviting me back for updates on conservation progress, timber management practices, and grazing lease arrangements that honored, in their own commercial fashion, the careful land stewardship my family practiced across 3 generations before selling. I found genuine peace visiting occasionally, watching cattle graze familiar pastures under new ownership. Understanding this arrangement represented the best possible outcome given everything that transpired. Land protected permanently from exactly the kind of fraudulent development scheme that once nearly succeeded through forgery and manufactured community pressure. Detective Reyes retired from active fraud investigation work eventually, transitioning into a training role mentoring newer detectives, often citing this particular case as a primary example of how patient, thorough investigation could successfully untangle sophisticated schemes hiding behind seemingly innocent community organizations and family relationships. I attended her retirement gathering when invited, genuinely grateful for everything her diligence had accomplished across the years. Understanding my own case had become something larger than my personal fight, ultimately contributing meaningfully toward better fraud investigation practices benefiting countless future victims facing similarly complicated situations. Ellis, still practicing law locally, mentioned occasionally handling similar HOA disputes for other rural landowners, always referencing lessons learned from my particular case, especially regarding the critical importance of thorough documentation from the very earliest signs of trouble. Exactly the habit that ultimately protected me throughout everything. I felt proud knowing my exhausting folder-keeping habits, born from simple ranching discipline rather than any legal sophistication, had ultimately become something of a template for protecting other families facing similar manufactured conflicts against determined, dishonest opposition wielding institutional authority they'd never legitimately deserved possessing. Emily eventually did pursue law school, specializing partly in property and land use law, occasionally mentioning our family's saga during classroom discussions about HOA governance, failures and fraudulent development schemes, transforming what began as painful personal experience into meaningful professional education benefiting her own future clients someday. I watched her graduate years later with immense pride, understanding something genuinely valuable had ultimately emerged from years of sustained hardship. My daughter finding purposeful direction partly through witnessing how patient, honest persistence could eventually overcome even the most determined, well-funded fraudulent opposition across extended, exhausting conflict. Ruth and I remained close friends across the years. Her loyalty during the darkest periods of this entire saga never forgotten, occasionally sharing dinner and reminiscing about everything endured together. Grateful the friendship forged through crisis had ultimately outlasted the specific conflict that originally brought us together so unexpectedly. Cedar Ridge, under continued transparent leadership, eventually became something of a model community locally, frequently referenced by county officials discussing effective HOA governance reform. An ironic but genuinely positive legacy emerging from what began as one woman's fraudulent, self-serving campaign against her rural neighbor's family land. I reflected often, across those following years, on how close everything came to unfolding completely differently, how easily exhaustion or financial pressure could have forced me toward accepting Gerald's original settlement offer, burying the truth permanently rather than pursuing accountability across such a lengthy, difficult legal process. But something in me, inherited perhaps from my father and grandfather's own quiet, stubborn integrity, refused accepting that easier path, understanding instinctively that surrendering to manufactured pressure would only encourage similarly determined, dishonest people toward targeting other vulnerable landowners facing comparable manipulation and institutional intimidation going forward. My final years on the remaining 5 acres passed peacefully, watching seasons cycle familiarly, occasionally hosting Emily and her own eventual family, building new memories. Atop land carrying such complicated, hard-won history now permanently secured through conservation protections and legal precedent established across years of sustained conflict. Patricia's company, honoring our original agreement's spirit beyond its strict legal requirements, occasionally consulted me on land management decisions, a courtesy extending well beyond contractual obligation, reflecting genuine respect built across years of watching how thoroughly my family had protected this land before circumstances forced its eventual sale. I thought often about my grandfather, wondering what he'd make of everything that transpired across these years. The forged permits, the courtroom battles, the federal investigations, ultimately concluding he'd likely feel proud watching his homestead marker remain protected permanently, regardless of everything required to secure that lasting protection. Marlene's eventual release from prison, occurring years after her original conviction, drew minimal local attention by that point, Cedar Ridge having moved thoroughly beyond her presidency's chaotic legacy, most current residents barely remembering the specific details of a saga that once dominated local news coverage extensively. I felt genuinely nothing hearing about her release, neither anger nor particular relief, simply the settled indifference that comes from a conflict thoroughly, permanently resolved years earlier through comprehensive legal accountability. Whatever remained of Marlene's life afterward existed entirely separate from mine, disconnected permanently by choice and circumstance both. Ruth mentioned Marlene relocated out of state following her release, apparently unwilling or unable to return to a community that remembered her original fraudulent scheme so thoroughly, choosing instead to rebuild whatever remained of her life somewhere carrying no direct connection to Cedar Ridge or its complicated history. Gerald, similarly, remained permanently distanced from the community, his own reputation equally damaged beyond meaningful local recovery. Both original architects of this elaborate fraudulent scheme ultimately scattered away from the very community and land they'd once so desperately, dishonestly sought to control and profit from. Cedar Ridge itself, meanwhile, continued thriving under transparent, accountable leadership years later, the second phase development permanently abandoned, the original entrance road properly renovated, and the entire community carrying forward genuine institutional lessons learned through witnessing exactly how catastrophically unchecked authority could damage trust when concentrated improperly. Looking back across everything, I understood the true cost of Marlene's ambition extended far beyond my own family's prolonged suffering. Touching Ruth's fear-driven silence, Alan's early dismissal from the finance committee, Gerald's ultimately ruined marriage and career, and an entire community's institutional trust requiring years of deliberate reform. Yet something meaningful ultimately emerged from all that accumulated damage. Stronger legal precedent protecting rural landowners against fraudulent HOA overreach. Better financial transparency. Requirements benefiting Cedar Ridge's 400 families. And my own daughter finding genuine professional purpose through witnessing sustained, patient pursuit of justice firsthand. The land itself, permanently protected now through conservation easement, would outlast every person involved in this extraordinary saga, the creek crossing flowing quietly regardless of whoever claimed ownership across future generations. My grandfather's homestead marker standing as permanent testament to exactly what deliberate, sustained protection ultimately accomplished. I sold 2,300 acres to stop a fraudulent scheme permanently, and in doing so, secured something far more valuable than the land itself ever represented alone. Genuine accountability for deliberate deception. Meaningful institutional reform within an entire community. And lasting protection for what truly mattered most. Emily often reminds me, whenever this saga comes up during family conversations, that fighting for truth rarely feels triumphant in the moment. Mostly just exhausting, uncertain, and prolonged. Real vindication, she says, arrives quietly, years later, through permanent conservation markers and thriving communities rather than dramatic courtroom victories alone. I've come to agree with her completely, understanding that genuine justice rarely resembles the satisfying, immediate resolution people often expect, instead unfolding gradually across years of patient documentation, sustained legal pressure, and quiet, unglamorous persistence against people convinced their own ambitions justified whatever deception proved necessary along the way. These days, I still walk my remaining 5 acres most mornings, coffee in hand, watching sunrise settle over land my family protected across generations. Cedar Ridge's gate sits visible in the distance, quiet now, its community finally functioning honestly, its fraudulent second-phase development permanently, completely, irreversibly dead. Marlene wanted a road across my land badly enough to forge documents, sabotage fences, and manufacture an entire community's fear against me. I answered by selling that land entirely, sealing shut forever the only path she ever truly wanted. Proving some doors, once closed properly, never reopen again. The road she illegally built now lies buried beneath restored pasture on land she'll never touch again. Protected permanently by conservation law, patient investigation, and one rancher's simple refusal to surrender what his family spent 60 honest years building.